Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello, everyone. Andrew, we are back for another podcast. Exciting times. We're up to the last step, are we not, Billy? The last step of your financial roadmap. Step 6, estate planning. Yeah. Interesting.
Absolutely.
Exciting.
Absolutely.
You've already done all the right things. You've amassed a huge amount of wealth, or you're going to amass a huge amount of wealth. Doesn't need to be at the end of the process. How do you plan for it, Billy? What is estate planning? Is it just a term that we throw around? Is it just a will? Take us through estate planning. What do you consider for your clients from an estate planning perspective?
Look, there's probably 2 steps to it. The first one is estate planning. So touch wood, eventually at the end of the day, when you're no longer around, what happens to your assets? So from an estate planning consideration, getting the right assets passed to the right people at the right time while minimizing the tax that you have to pay along the way. That's probably the first element to the estate planning conversation that we help and have with clients. The second part is when something happens, but you're still around. Think about where you're in a position where you can't make your own decisions because something's happened. So you may have heard the term being thrown around about a power of attorney or a guardianship and things like that. So they're really the 2 elements to estate planning that we think about, that we talk to clients about when we're taking them through this last step of the financial planning journey that we talk to them about.
Perfect. As Billy said, there's really 2 main things that we're looking at. And the first of which is making sure that when you're leaving some money to your beneficiary, making sure that it's, well, not just a beneficiary, but your beneficiaries, for most people, a combination of a few people, really making sure that your assets are passed the right people and at the right point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on something that's interesting enough. With the family unit that we see, most of the time, it's not really that straightforward. Sometimes it is, where you've just got a husband and wife and a couple of kids or whatever it may be, whether they're adult children or not. But what happens in the event where you've got blended families, or you've got people have separated, and there's a whole range of different stuff happening. So one of the things that we talk to clients about is getting a really clear picture around what it is that they want to see happen in the event that they're no longer around. And that's kind of the starting point. And ordinarily, it's easy enough to turn around and say, hey, everything gets split down the line and one of my kids will get 50%, my other child will get another 50%. It doesn't always work like that because of a whole range of different family issues that can be present, but even down to a particular asset type. I mean, if you're trying to split a difficult asset like a house, or if you own 2 houses, for argument's sake, and you want to leave one to one child and one to another, if the houses aren't worth the same amount of money, how do you then split that? So estate equalisation, balancing up the proceeds that everybody receives, is crucial. So unpacking this and making sure that it's fair and equitable and realistic, because if it's not realistic and you're disadvantaging a particular beneficiary that's entitled to something, then unfortunately your estate can be contested, and the only people that win in that circumstance, unfortunately, is the lawyers and the solicitors. And I tell you what, they're very good at charging for time and energy spent. And before you know it, you've got estates that are worth a lot of money that start to disappear very, very quickly when that sort of stuff happens.
Totally true, and a very good point. Really, you don't want to get into an instance where your estate is contested. It's something that is never pleasant for any party other than, as you said, Billy, the lawyers and the solicitors. Apologies to all of my friends and clients. My wife's a lawyer, so I've got a lot of them that are lawyers. There's nothing wrong with what you're doing, but really you want to make sure that you've got a good plan, a good estate plan, so that it can minimize the likelihood of anything like that happening in the future.
Yep, well said, Andrew. Beneficiaries receiving lump sums versus income streams. I guess there's different ways. There's a little bit of flexibility around things like superannuation and assets that are liquid that can do that. You want to talk us through a couple of those intricacies, Andrew?
I mean, when you're making an estate plan and when you're sort of making sure that the assets are going to the right people and at the right time, it's imperative to really consider who do you want to receive that money, which, as we've already touched on, is important. But when do you want them to receive it? I mean, Do you want an 18-year-old child to receive a lump sum of $1 million? Are they going to be prudent in order to make sure that all of your hard work over the course of your lifetime is being put to good use? And I'm not saying that plenty of 18-year-olds that are fantastic with their money and are doing some really great things from a wealth creation perspective, but that's not always the case for everyone. And so you want to make sure that you're making the right decisions as to whether your beneficiary actually just receives everything in a lump sum, whether some of your beneficiaries receive everything in a lump sum, or whether you leave some beneficiaries with an income stream that's going to last them a number of years and then they receive a lump sum, or whether it's going to be an income stream that lasts their lifetime. I mean, a big thing that we talk about is intergenerational wealth. A lot of people want to make sure that it's not just their immediate kids that are benefiting from all of their hard work, but their grandchildren and generations afterwards that are also going to benefit from that.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head and really touched on a good point there, Andrew, that when it comes to estate planning, there's a lot of different things to take into consideration, a lot of different vehicles that we can potentially use to try and customize an estate plan to meet the needs of that family and what that means. And one of the things that we wanted to drill down on and dig a little bit deeper is the use of testamentary trusts, what they are and how we can use those to be able to leave money to people in certain circumstances. So pretty straightforward. Testamentary trust is a trust that gets created when somebody else passes away. And with the creation of that trust, you can then balance of the estate or the proceeds of the estate can go into a testamentary trust, and you can then essentially dictate or control when the assets of the testamentary trust become available for that individual. You're putting a lot more hurdles and barriers around that estate and around that money. Quite often we see testamentary trusts being written into wills for things like what you touched on before, Andrew, where you've got young children and in the event that something happens, you don't want that child to receive the money or the proceeds of the estate when they turn 18. I don't know about you, Andrew, but when I was an 18-year-old, I definitely wasn't in that category of what you were talking about before. I think I would have blown all of that money in about 6 months' time. But in an instance where a testamentary trust is created, what you can have is you can turn around and say, as an example, of the money that's available in the estate, when that child turns 18, we want them to get 5%, access to 5% of the money. When they turn 21, we want them to be able to have another 10%. When they turn 25, another percentage, or a range of different combinations like that. The idea is to be able to get some flexibility in your estate planning to try and help a couple of things, really. From the beneficiary's perspective, you want to make it relevant and timely for them. I don't think you don't want a young person having access to everything all in one go, because if they don't manage it properly, if they're a little bit reckless with it, like we all were when we were that age, they get to 10 years, 5 years down the track, and all of a sudden, all of that hard work and effort that whoever gifted them that money gave them, all of that's gone, and you definitely don't want that happening. So testamentary trust is something that we see being used time and time again to be able to help with the flexibility around that estate planning piece, Andrew.
And a testamentary trust is really all about, it's not a matter of limiting the amount of money that you're gifting to people, because obviously if you're leaving some money behind to someone, you clearly care about that person. It's not making it difficult for them or anything. It's making sure that they're going to be taken care of. So it's putting the barriers in place to make sure that they're, in some instances, protected from themselves. And included in that, which unfortunately does form part of an estate plan, is having barriers, disabled children that don't even have the ability, even if they wanted to make those financial decisions. So really caring for those that you love most and those that you're leaving your hard-earned money behind to, and putting some really great barriers and strategies in place to give yourself the most flexibility in what you're leaving behind.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Andrew. I've had a client recently where we were talking through this process. Their only child, unfortunately, drug affected. So in the event that something happened to the parents, they wanted a testamentary trust set up, and they wanted the income stream only, so not the assets, but they wanted their son to be able to benefit from the income that those assets derive. And they parked it in a testamentary trust to provide that level of protection, because unfortunately the son, he couldn't care for himself. And that was really the best thing that the parents could do, is to give him access to that income stream. Because if you gave him access to the lump sum and the control over the particular assets that the estate would have, they would disappear very, very, very quickly.
Absolutely. The other thing that's while we're on the topic and while we're sort of talking about children and those that you're leaving behind, is making sure that you've got some legal guardians for the dependents and the people that are dependent on you. Take us through it, Billy. What's included in an estate plan that's going to take care of, other than just financial care, those that are dependent on you?
There's really two elements to it, and I find this conversation, when we're having it with clients, very, very interesting. We do some fantastic work around wealth creation and setting a plan for people and pointing them in the right direction. And then you talk about the estate planning piece when it comes to their children and say, okay, as an example, you've got young children. In the event that something happens to both of you, who's going to look after the kids? And I see it time and time again. Husband looks at the wife looks at the husband. Husband's like, my mum's going to do it. Wife's like, my mum's going to do it. And I'm like, okay, guys, this is the reason why we have to have this conversation. So it's not just about having that conversation within the family unit. It's about actually going one step further and getting that done properly and getting that done through your will and your power of attorney in your estate to make sure that the guardianships are in place for your children. And there's really a handful of elements to it. I think the first thing is going through that and really thinking about who's going to provide the best care for your children and who's going to raise your children the same way that you'd like them to be raised. So that's the first thing. Formalizing it and communicating it out to the parties involved. So if you do have somebody there, making sure that they understand the responsibilities and the obligations that do come with that. And then lastly, from a financial perspective, you want to make sure that you've got the financial support available. And we spoke in previous episodes about insurance and the like, but you've got the financial support available. So whoever becomes the guardian for your children has the resources to be able to bring them up the way that not only that you'd like them to be, but it doesn't put additional strain onto them as well too. So it's not just a simple question of saying, okay, who's going to look after the kids if we're no longer around? There's a lot more that gets unpacked, and we flush that out with clients and go through that process with them.
Yeah, brilliant. And not only, as you said, there's taking care of the children and those that you're leaving behind if you're no longer around, but in a proper estate plan, you're also making sure that there's someone there or there's someone appointed in order to take care of you if you can't make those decisions. And there's really two main elements to making sure that someone can take care of you, and that's the medical decisions that are made on your behalf. So who's going to make medical decisions for you if you can't make those decisions yourself? But there's also who's going to manage your financial affairs if you can't do so. And that doesn't necessarily need to be, it can be, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the same person. In some families, one person is equipped and able to make the medical decisions, but you wouldn't necessarily trust them to make all of your financial decisions. So you can have different people that are doing different things if you can't make those decisions on your own.
And you can have multiple people too as well. So you can have a handful of financial attorneys, you can have a handful of medical attorneys. It doesn't need to just be one person, but ultimately when you are thinking through that, you need to think of the person who will make a decision based on your best interest and who'd really make the same decision that you would if they were in your shoes. And that's really not necessarily just the person who's closest to you. You need to make sure that they'll be making the right decisions as well too. So it's not one to be taken lightly. And just on a sort of quick sort of side note, from a financial power of attorney, it doesn't necessarily mean, or you don't just have a financial power of attorney when you can't make those decisions. For argument's sake, not that long ago, I was interstate and I wanted to bid on a particular property. I gave somebody financial power of attorney specifically to bid on a particular property on a particular date for a particular price range that they could go up to. And outside of the capacity of that particular exercise, everything else remained with me. Unfortunately, I didn't get the house, but you can get quite specific in relation to that. It doesn't just come down to if you can't make decisions. If you're not present, you can also have those things there available for you as well.
Yeah, lucky you didn't give me that power of attorney, Billy. I would have certainly bid all the way up to what the house went for, and you definitely would have got it. Might have overpaid a little bit, but
we did. We put a cap in there anyway, so we weren't near it. We weren't near it anyway. But that's one of the other things that you can do from an estate planning perspective, because it doesn't just have to come down to end of life or when you're incapacitated. One of the other key considerations for estate planning, we spoke about the right people at the right time, but we also want to manage the tax and pay as little as tax as possible when it comes to any estate planning. Andrew, you want to talk us through some of those things and what that looks like?
Yeah. Tax planning and estate planning are two things that really joint at the hip. An estate plan doesn't only need to be things like a testamentary trust, like a will. An effective estate plan is also imperative in the investment planning and the investment decisions that you make. So we don't have a inheritance tax per se in Australia. However, depending on where your assets are held is going to determine the amount of capital gains tax that's paid, as well as some tax on beneficiaries receiving funds, particularly from superannuation, and particularly when it's to non-spouse or financially dependent children. But we're going sort of a little bit I'm not going to go too much in detail as to the tax consequences, but an important consideration when you're thinking about your wealth creation is not just around what are the best things for me from a tax perspective, what are the best things or what are the best asset structures and the best vehicles to hold your assets from a tax planning consideration for your beneficiaries and the people that you're leaving money behind to. There's a whole myriad of strategies that you can deploy in order to make sure that you're minimizing the tax. There's recontribution strategies to super and all of that stuff that I'm sure we'll speak more about in other podcasts where we can delve into the intricate details of it. But making sure that you're holding the assets in the right structure and in the right way can minimize the tax that your beneficiaries need to pay when you leave the money behind to them.
Well said, Andrew. Well said. One of the other areas that often get overlooked when we're talking about estate planning is protecting your beneficiaries' inheritance from a relationship breakdown. And I'll give you an example. Mum and dad pass away and give their children, 2 kids, 50% of the estate each. And with one of the adult children that receives that, they're in a relationship with somebody, they're in a marriage with someone, and there's a marriage breakdown. So all of a sudden, 50% of the family's wealth that mum and dad had created is now at risk because they've received that inheritance and their marriage is on the rocks and has started to break down. And all of a sudden, the spouse or the ex-spouse is entitled to a large chunk of mum and dad's money, essentially. That's something that gets overlooked when we're talking about estate planning. And some of the things that we talk our clients through is it's not only what you want to see happen with the money, but it's what's going to happen with the money when your beneficiaries receive it as well too. So there's a couple of things that we talk to people about, and there's a couple of structures that we can put in place to help manage that process. And we touched on a testamentary trust earlier. There's also a family trust that could receive the inheritance of an estate. And there are a couple of the mechanisms and a few of the things that we'll flush out with clients to be able to help not only protect them to get the right money to the right people at the right time, but also to make sure that their beneficiaries are protected in the event that that's a reality for them. Because that's a really common thing. We're seeing more and more blended families. We're seeing more and more relationship breakdown as time goes on. And putting all of this time and effort into creating wealth, putting a good financial plan in place, we need to be prudent and go a little few steps further to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can to protect the family's wealth from as much as we could possibly foresee.
Totally true, Billy. I mean, again, and similar to the risk mitigation and insurance topic that we were talking about before, it's one of those things that you hope won't actually happen and won't be the case, but it's a risk mitigation and an insurance policy that if something does happen, there's some protection mechanisms in place in order to make sure that you're helping the people that you're leaving the money behind to the people that you want to leave the money behind to. So ultimately, you hope that all of these things moot points and you're not going to need to rely on, but it's an important consideration and it's a really important thing to make sure that you're leaving the money behind to those that you specifically want to leave those funds behind to. The other really, really important part with it is making sure that your estate plan is up to date. It's very easy to get away from you. Not unfortunately, I think maybe even in some instances, fortunately, but our own morality is something that we don't want to think about on an ongoing basis. It's a pretty daunting thing for most people. And so you sort of want to set it, forget about it, have to think about it when you're doing it, and then never think about it again. But it's one of those things that as and when your circumstances change, as you acquire additional assets, as your own decisions, what you want to see happen change, you have to constantly look at your estate plan, and you have to constantly look at, is it up to date? Is it exactly what I want to happen, or is it just something that I wrote 10 years ago that isn't necessarily my wishes at the moment?
Yeah, set and forget is definitely not the way to go about it. Reviewing your circumstances, getting an understanding of where everything sits. When your circumstances do change, get it reviewed. It's a highly complex area that, unfortunately, if you get wrong, the consequences are extremely significant and costly, and can have a significant benefit on your estate, on your beneficiaries, the amount of tax that they need to pay, who gets the money, does it get held up in the court system, a whole range of different things. So you really want to get some expert advice around this. You want to review it constantly. When there's a change in your life, that seems to be the main trigger point that most people start to think about that. When we're engaging with clients, Andrew, that's something that we're talking to them about every time that we're engaging with them on a formal basis, just to make sure that you don't miss anything. Because like I said, if you do get it wrong, it can be quite significant and detrimental as well too. But look, hopefully we covered a range of things that sort of shed some light on estate planning and the intricacies with estate planning and what can and can't be done, or should and shouldn't be done. And hopefully we've shed some light on that and provided a value for our listeners.
Hope that you guys have gotten some really valuable insights into what we think about. And this also brings us to the end of the 6-part series, or the 6 steps that we're talking about on a wealth creation journey. So hopefully this has tied it off nicely and put a nice little bow around developing your financial plan and your financial roadmap over the course of your life. There are going to be some very important topics that we sort of touched on but didn't delve into detail. So we will continue this series and sort of pick and choose the important things that we're going to talk about as in sort of when those topics come up. So look out for the remainder of the insights into financial planning, wealth creation, growing your wealth, all of that stuff. We're going to continue to post insights. But yeah, this is the end of the road when it comes to the generic financial plan and the sort of overarching structure and bones of it.
Well said, Andrew. And listeners, thank you for your time. And we look forward to bringing you more insights into the world of financial planning soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about, or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature, and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.